Greetings, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our panel discussion this evening. I'm your moderator, Christine Douglas-Williams, an author, journalist, and board member with Canadians for the Rule of Law. This webinar is part 2 of 3. We will be announcing our final one sometime coming up in the near future. Our topic today is hatred out of control, solutions and the challenges. How far are we prepared to go? Police data and other reports document that hatred is exploding online. Not surprising, really. It's tough to monitor and police the internet. Our esteemed panelists today are lawyers and law experts with interests in human rights. You'll hear more about them in greater detail as I introduce them before their speeches, but in brief, they are Anita Bromberg, a lawyer and human rights advocate, Julius Gray, a constitutional and human rights law expert, and Leo Adler, an international and Canadian criminal law expert. We will cover some of the manifestations of discrimination and racism today and explore questions like, how do we strike the right balance in countering discrimination? For example, does anti-Semitism receive enough attention under the increasingly popularized principles of critical race theory, which focuses primarily on racialized groups and LGBTQ+, a topic we covered on our first webinar on March 3rd. And how do we monitor and end hate, particularly online, while still honoring Canadian laws and our fundamental rights and freedoms, which are essential in advancing and maintaining rule of law in Canada? What about ambiguities on what constitutes an offense? Where do we draw the lines between hurt feelings and violation of Canadian hate laws? Who decides or arbitrates? Human rights commissions, courts, judges, the government via more legislation? These have been much contemplated questions, even dilemmas, and going forward in the aim to effectively counter hate on and offline and come up with effective solutions that will strengthen rule of law in Canada. We need open, honest discussions, which we encourage here at Canadians for the Rule of Law. Before I introduce our first guest, a word to you. Following their speeches, we will allow you, our listeners, the opportunity to pose your questions. Please type them out, and Anita Bromberg, who is doubling up with us today as one of our guests and taking questions, will get to as many as possible, time permitting, during the Q&A portion of this evening. And Anita is our first guest to replace Barbara Perry. Anita will provide you with an overview of the big question this evening. Do current proposals to counter hate, whether online or on the street, provide effective solutions that will strengthen rule of law in Canada? Anita Bromberg is a lawyer and member of the Ontario Law Society. She presently serves as Secretary for Canadians for the Rule of Law and President of the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation. She was former Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and legal counsel for B'nai B'rith Canada. Anita, thank you.
Hi, thank you, everybody, and I'm honored to be part of this panel and bring you a bit of an overview as we look at the issues that our moderator, Christine, raised. What I'm going to present to you today and talk in the 10 minutes I have is, first I'm going to look a little bit at the context, that the questions that our moderator has raised, the nature of the problem, some of the solutions that are before us, both present and proposed, and then a brief introduction to the challenges that I'm going to then turn over to our two panelists to discuss with you in their time. Sorry, it is not going to allow me to go to the next screen. There we go. Okay. So in terms of the context of the problem, I thought perhaps we should just take a moment and define rule of law, a term that actually, when I joined the organization, made me pause to think, what exactly do we mean by it? It's a very important term. It's the very foundation of our democracy, and why it is why the Canadians for Rule of Law were actually formed, looking at very principles of fairness by which we must govern ourselves and hold not only ourselves responsible for, but our public and private institutions. As I say, the very root of democracy, and issues around hate, particularly online hate, and how we resolve them are a challenge to the very rule of law that calls for participation by all equally in our democracy. So what is the nature, and I'm focusing here particularly on the problem of online hate, but we need to look where the information we have, where the information of the figures we have about what's our problem with hate crimes. So first place I look is the hate crimes reports that is collected through the different police forces across Canada, which they collect year to year, and it goes into report. You can find it on Stats Canada. And the last reported year was 2020. We're awaiting 2021, which comes later in the year. It was a stellar year of an increase of, they noted 37%. 2,669 reported hate crimes. That doesn't talk about how many get resolved, how many are where perpetrators are found, and so forth. In the stats, if you read through it, you'll see that the Black population is most commonly targeted overall, and certainly that was the case 2020 in the ethnic category. And then the next nearest category is the Jewish population, which is captured under the title of religious communities. Historically, you will see that the Black, Jewish, LGBT communities, as well as the Muslim populations, tend to be the most targeted. 2020 was remarkable, by the way, and you'll not be surprised with the rise of the coronavirus, the epidemic, that the Asian population, both East, Southeast Asian populations, saw a dramatic increase in hate crimes. How do we measure online hate? Well, B'nai B'rith Canada puts out a report frequently, yearly rather, and it was actually a report that I was involved with writing for many years. And when they're capturing anti-Semitic remarks, they actually note that 71% of the harassment cases involved anti-Semitism that was documented online. And in fact, in 2020, that showed a 11% increase. Now, of course, other institutions have tried to capture it. I would recommend that you take a look at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation website. They captured, last year they did a survey about what is the experience with online hate and racism. And there's some key findings there. This is just one of the many charts. You can see that people acknowledge that it is a problem that they want dealt with. They found that millions of Canadians, in fact, 35 million Canadians, are in one way using the internet and social media platforms. 68% of us are using it daily. From that experience, many people have reported experiencing racist, sexist, even homophobic comments. 42% say that they've seen or experienced comments. Racialized Canadians report 3 times more likely to have experienced hate online. And you won't be surprised to find that younger Canadians, as heavy users of the internet, are far more likely to have experienced or faced hateful comments than any other group. By almost a margin of 2 to 1, Canadians indicate that they are very worried about the impact of hateful speech. And 78% say they want something done about it. So take a look if you get a chance at a very extensive survey, actually, and unique because it's not commonly captured. Another way to look at what the problem is to see what actually is on the internet. And I offer you a few of the pictures that came up in the last year or so. I focus just because there's a limited time and because of our sponsors and the interest in anti-Semitism. These are just a few of the examples of what you might find by a quick browsing online and what you might encounter that's anti-Semitic. What's clear is that social media, whether it's TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, are all having to face this question about what to do about anti-Semitic ideas. Social media is clearly the soapbox of this generation, bringing anti-Semitic and other racist ideas to an all-new generation. As one person put it, anti-Semitism is allowed to flourish on platforms whose users are mainly young people, according to current research. And you can see from these examples that I pull that the internet is not only a new technology, but it is reviving age-old anti-Jewish tropes. For example, control of the world, bloodletting, the evil looking Jew, and of course, blaming the virus epidemic on members of the Jewish community was all too common on the internet in the last couple of years. Of course, we've got other concerns about what's going on in the internet, such as spreading misinformation. And the question is our legislation up to dealing with all this? So I just want to take a few minutes just to set the stage about what are some of the pieces of legislation that are there to help us deal with it. The two main provisions, 318 and 319 of the Criminal Code, advocating genocide, publicly incited hatred, and willful promotion of hatred against an identifiable group. Not a well-used provisions, but there have been some high-profile cases, and certainly Leo and Julius will be equipped to deal with it. Section 320 is often forgotten, but it allows the removal of hate propaganda by court order from a computer system that might be available to the public. Let's take a look at a couple of other things. The Anti-Terrorism Act is out there. There's certainly problems with it in terms of not distinguishing between hate and terrorism, and where's that line? But where you're advocating or promoting the commission of terrorism offenses, a judge may be able to seize the propaganda, take it offline, delete it, and of course, deal with sanctions for it. There was a section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act that was a provision that allowed the commission or the tribunal to deal with hate messages found online. And is it 2012, I believe, that provision was removed. So the commission can no longer at the very moment deal with online hate, something we'll get to as one of the proposals that we need to look at. All this is done, of course, in the context of Section 2 of the Charter, where we have to deal with how far are we prepared to go when we consider our fundamental freedoms, freedom of speech, thought, and so forth, as set out in Section 2 of the Canadian Charter. Now, I just want to take 2 more minutes before I turn it over and talk about a few of the proposals that are up now in our as proposed pieces of legislation. And that, as I've mentioned, Section 13 was deleted, but there's now C36 is proposed to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act, basically giving the jurisdiction back to the Commission to deal with online hate, hate that appears on the internet. And you can see the language there, hate speech likely to foment detestation or vilification, big words, of an individual group on the basis of a prohibited ground of discrimination. And there's been much discussion about whether that's the right form, is that the right wording, and I hope we'll have a bit of a discussion around that. Just in the last couple of days, when was the budget handed down? There was an introduction of a suggestion that they're going to introduce Holocaust denial as a form of hate, a specific form of hate into the criminal code. There has been measures or bills providing amendments to the Broadcasting Act to deal with online content, specifically aimed at commercial sites. And of course, there's an argument that does it touch on the kinds of non-commercial activity that often is the focus of hate. There's also debate whether it goes far enough, but we'll, I hopefully have some discussion around. The other piece of legislation right now, or proposed legislation, C229, recently suggested by a private member, I believe, that the criminal code should be amended to ban symbols of hate, anything relating to hate propaganda, making it an offense to publicly display visual representations promoting hatred or violence against an identifiable group. So there, of course, are non-legislative solutions. The European Union recently had a conference, and they emphasized that if you want to deal with hate, you've got to up education and training, both in the public and in the amongst first responders and so forth, better investigations, dealing with definitions and stats and methodology, improving cooperation across governments, not only in Canada, but from our allies, and of course, encourage community initiatives. So now, as I turn it over, let me just say that there are a lot of discussion around what are the challenges. How far are we prepared to go? One headline said that the new online streaming bill won't hurt free speech. Of course, that same article went on to talk about how problematic it was. Another headline suggests that if you're going to turn hatred into a crime, you've got all kinds of problems. Will penalties create disproportionate sanctions? Will there be problems with the definition, and so forth? Back to the Broadcasting Act, Michael Geist, who's a leading voice in this area, has voiced some considerable reservations, if you will, about its overreach of jurisdiction, difficulties in regulating the programs, and what he calls discoverability provisions. That is, who's going to find the problems and report them. Back just for a minute to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation survey, which tells you that people are worried about it. By a margin of 2 to 1, people are worried about it, and they do want something to do and something done about it. And in fact, the survey has suggested that they're even ready to compromise people's freedom of speech or privacy in order to get the job done. So where do we go from here as we strike the right balance? That's my question to our next two panelists.
Thank you for that, Anita. Now, our next guest is Julius Gray. Mr. Gray is a renowned lawyer with over 40 years of experience and practice in several areas of law. He was a member of the Faculty of Law at McGill University from 1977 to 2002 and taught at the University of Montreal and the Canadian Human Rights School in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. He also served as president of the Canadian Human Rights Foundation from 1985 to 1988. Julius's book, Capitalism and the Alternatives, was released in 2019 by McGill Queen's University Press. It describes his vision for a renewed social contract, seeking to rehabilitate economic equality as a fundamental social goal built on universal values such as individualism, liberty, and even romanticism. Julius, it's an honor. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you. I'm honored to be here. It's a pleasure to speak to you. And I will start with my proposition. I'm a believer in near untrammeled free speech. I can live with the extreme hate legislation or with legislation that prohibits the advocating of crimes, whether they're racial or not, saying that all members of a group should be killed, or saying that a particular individual should be killed. can be invalid and should be illegal under the criminal code. But I must say that the prohibition of hate speech as it exists right now has been held by the court to refer only to the most extreme in Kijkstra is quite useless. How many Kijkstras are there? If you only apply it to the Kijkstras, you haven't solved any problem. And I say you shouldn't apply it to everybody. What I'd like to challenge is the view that there is an increase in hate. There isn't. When I was a boy in the late 50s and early 60s, there were no Jewish judges. There were quotas at McGill and other universities. In Quebec, French Canadians were making half of what English Canadians were making. There was no mixed marriage allowed in Quebec between different religions. Homosexuality was a crime. Natives only got to vote in 1958. And Black people were still subject to segregation in the United States and lynching. And there were very few rights that they actually had in Canada. And when we look at today's Canada, of course, I'll give you many other examples of that, we've solved so many of these problems under a regime of virtually no hate legislation. It's only towards the end of that period, 1980, that we were prosecuting the Kijkstras. It's not true. Compared to what was there then, today's manifestations of hate are the expression of frustration by people who have no power. In those days, it's the powers that be that excluded Blacks, Jews, Arabs, Chinese, and so on. Today, it's a phenomenon of the frustrated and the angry who put something on the net. But obviously, in today's world, the degree of opportunity, equality, if you're Muslim, Jewish, minority, Black, whatever, is far greater, and we didn't have such laws. What happened in 1980 is that the creation of multiculturalism and the lobby type of politics led to the creation of groups which started promoting themselves, and largely by saying, you can't say anything about it. So one group didn't want the Muhammad cartoons. Another group didn't want strong criticism of Israel. Another group didn't want strong endorsement of Israel. Another group said that being against abortion or whatever is hate. And so on. And at university today, you could get canceled for questioning land claims or all sorts of things that one would have to call sacred cows. I'm not saying that there is no danger. I think the present wokeism is likely to produce a reaction. There may be an increase. The improvement took place between 1960 and 1980 during what Thomas Piketty calls les 30 glorieuses, the glorious years of growing equality and social justice right after World War II. And today, it may not be. There may be certain threats, but I think the way we can face those threats is through freedom of expression. What will happen if we do not have freedom of expression is there will be some people who will feel that they've been repressed and that there is some deep mystery about the role of Jews or Muslims or whoever, whatever conspiracy theory somebody chooses to peddle. Whereas if you can say it, most people will understand that it's nonsense. One of the strange theories is that if you let somebody like Hitler or Kijkstra speak, it will become irresistible to people. That's not true. That's not why Nazi Germany happened. It happened because of economic reasons, because of the Treaty of Versailles, because of the Depression and so on. But the belief that people will follow crazy hate is, I think, one of the most pessimistic views that I've seen. I think if you have robust answers to them, they will remain as marginal as they actually are. Holocaust denial, how many Holocaust deniers are there? I've never met a denier, and I've met people who were anti-Semites and so on, and I think they virtually lost their influence in the 1960s and 70s, when I was one of the first people of Jewish origin to be taken into what was considered an English law firm in Montreal. People were talking about it. It was worth debating. A partner in the firm told me once that women are beautiful and charming, but they're not equal. Will you find somebody saying something like that today? It's much better, and it's freedom of expression that has brought this about. Freedom of expression is our defense against wokeness, our defense against cancel culture. And also, it is the road forward towards equality, because with freedom of expression, people will realize that the deepening chasm between the rich and the poor is what is causing the competition between groups and the promotion of what I call petty hate by people of no influence, but large frustration. In the recent case, which I had the honor of presenting to the Supreme Court, the majority, unfortunately only a 5-4 majority, said no one has a right not to be offended. That was the Mike Ward case. And of course, that's true. Freedom of expression is only important if it includes unpleasant things. You don't need freedom of expression to say motherhood and apple pie. If you want to tell everybody how much you like your mother, nobody's going to repress you. It's when you want to do a cartoon of Muhammad, or when you want to say something controversial about Middle East politics, or any of the many, or when you want to argue something about family law that offends either the woke or the non-woke, that's when you get people saying, let's repress it. So I would say that untrammeled freedom of expression is not only something that doesn't harm us and will not lead to an increase in hate. I would say it will protect us against hate. I will end by pointing out an example. In the 1940s and 50s, Tito in Yugoslavia, while he was quite liberal as a communist, was very firm about repressing hate. He knew that he was sitting on a cauldron in Yugoslavia, and he made sure nobody could call anybody a Muslim or an Orthodox or a Jew or anything like that, because that was dangerous. Yes, you understand, and he was in good faith, and he really wanted to keep the country together, to maintain mixed marriage and so on, which was common in Sarajevo. What happened when the government changed? Prohibiting speech does not repress the hate. Allowing speech is the pedagogical tool, which will make sure that there is you never have zero racism, but much less and much less influential racism. And those people who think that they're subject because they get an insult or on the net, or somebody calls them a name, or there's a fight between Palestinian students and Jewish students at a university, those people who think that they're subjected to hate should remember what happened to me when I came to Canada in 1957. My uncle was already here, and he told my father, his future is limited, you know. He can't get jobs outside the community. There is a quote on McGill, he's 9 years old, you don't know how he'll do. He may not get into law or medicine if he wants to. There is no way of getting public jobs in Quebec or in Canada. My uncle said a sober, truthful thing to my father. Did that continue? I have never felt discriminated in my whole life, because it changed in a world in there was freedom, and we didn't punish people and try to prove that this can be said, but this can't be said. Let's adopt freedom of expression as part of what I call romantic individualism. You can say anything you want, and we will create an equal, just, and free society. Let's keep the freedom. Thank you.
Excellent, Julius. Thank you. Our final guest is Leo Adler, an international and criminal law expert. Mr. Adler is founder and senior member of Leo Adler, a full-service criminal, quasi-criminal, and regulatory law firm that specializes in international cases. Among his membership, the Canadian Society of Forensic Science, the Criminal Lawyers Association, the American Society of International Law, and Leo was one of the founding members of the International Criminal Bar. Leo has conducted trials and appeals throughout Canada up to the Supreme Court, and several of his cases have been reported as legal precedents. He has also been consulted regarding cases from the US and elsewhere. He has published various articles and appeared on many media programs commenting on forensic, criminal justice, and national security issues in Canada and abroad. In addition, Leo has either spoken at or chaired panels and committees dealing with domestic and international criminal law and human rights. He has also appeared as a witness before Senate and House of Commons committees on a variety of legal issues. Great to have you with us, Leo.
Thank you. Julius and I both had the same political science professor at McGill, and both of us have a rather similar background. We weren't born in Canada. We came to Canada. And I remember my mother taking me to the nearest school, which happened to be a Catholic school, and the priest said, "Es-tu catholique?" My mother said, "No, nous sommes juifs." "Oh no, vous êtes protestant." And so I ended up in the Protestant school board. Like Julius, I remember by the time I moved to Toronto to go to law school and went for an articling position and being told, "Oh, you'd be much better and much more comfortable in your own kind." This is in the mid-70s in Toronto. So yes, there's been a certain improvement, but I'm sorry, Julius, it hasn't improved to the point where we don't need the legislation that we do. Rule of law depends on free speech and the ability to express yourself, the debate, strong disagreements, and in this respect, I do agree, the acceptance of unacceptable values that are expressed. But there does come a point where there is a hate speech. And I want to make it very clear that there is a distinction between hate speech and speech that discriminates. The old Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act and the various provincial legislation that provides for speech that discriminates is one thing, but hate speech is another. And for the same reason that Holocaust denial has to become a crime, because the trivialization ultimately of the Holocaust brings it to the point of denial. My uncle just died. He and my aunt are the last two of the Holocaust generation. Julius and I are first generation of the survivors. But once the Holocaust survivors are gone, and once we are gone because we knew what our parents went through, it becomes hatred, and it becomes a way of deriding not only our history, but the history of others. And so anti-Semitism, and I know that Anita went through her statistics, traditionally has always been number one. Whenever there is a new form of public media, of public presentation, it's anti-Semitism that leads the way, whether it's in print, whether it's film, radio, television, telephone, and now through social media and the internet. And while the laws are always trying to catch up and to try and deal with various aspects, they don't always succeed. Ultimately, you need to have an actual ability to prosecute what is hate speech. Julius pointed out that in the Ward decision, the majority said that nobody has a right not to be offended. Being offended is not the same as being the target of hate speech. It doesn't lead to the same results, and it differentiates. It is different from hate speech. The one thing that I am rather offended by, frankly, is that when you look at Section 319 and the various subsections, as an example, the public incitement for genocide, you know what the maximum penalty is? And it's been reduced from what it used to be. The maximum penalty, if it's preceded by way of indictment, is all of 2 years in jail. You get more for a theft than you do for publicly inciting genocide. You get public incitement of hatred, also a maximum of 2 years if they proceed by way of indictment. Otherwise, it's what we call a summary conviction, or if you're a fan of American television, a misdemeanor type of an offense. And whereas in the past, we had people who we could thank for leading the way and making sure that those who spout hate are made to or brought to account, whether it's Sabrina Citron or Richard Warman with their various initiations. You can't do that anymore. Now you have to go to the Attorney General and get the Attorney General's consent in order to be able to prosecute someone. Nevertheless, I think there's a good lesson to be learned. And in fact, a very recent decision is a decision from Quebec, from the Superior Court there, called Regina versus Dion, 2020 QCCS 3049 for those who want to do it. At paragraphs 17 and 18, they talk about the history. They hearken back, and Julius may or may not remember, to the Cohen Committee. At the time that we would have gone into McGill in the late 60s, hatred was on the rise. And the Cohen Committee was assembled. The report was presented in 1966. And finally, the first hate legislation was passed in 1970. Frankly, it's been watered down ever since. It's been watered down to the point that today you can get away with saying anything that, not just being free speech, not simply being offensive, not simply being something that is controversial, but that actually causes hate. And that is one of the things that is still happening. And for that reason, we need to maintain the legislation, and we need to make sure that those who cause this type of speech, this is not the Canada that we immigrated to. It was a racist Canada. There's no two ways about it. There was a Canada where if you were Chinese, you couldn't even become a member of the bar, at least in British Columbia, until the late 50s. It was a Canada that was discriminatory. But when they faced up to it, that was a turning point, and it was a shining point. And we need to maintain that light as opposed to dimming it. And we need to be able to shine it on all types of hate that comes in whatever form. And after all, there are always new ways of expressing hate that are being found, and it's time that we deal with them. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that speech, Leo. Now, before we go to the Q&A, we're going to provide a short segment to give our guests any opportunity to discuss together, pose any possible questions to one another, or make final statements. Now, before we proceed, I'd like to actually pose to our guests, to Leo and to Julius, because right off the top, there seemed to be a little bit of a disagreement. And the question comes as to, where do you put the line between offense and breaking the law? We know that the government comes out with various legislations, and the question is, who really defines those? How are they to be interpreted? What about the nuances? There's a lot of confusion out there as to what exactly constitutes hate. Right from the beginning, many are saying, why do we need other bills? We already have hate laws. Can the two of you provide, and you too, Anita, some guidelines to make things a little bit more clear when it comes to trying to differentiate between hate, between offense, and what the government perhaps is trying to bring about under certain legislation?
I can try to answer this. I think in the Keekstra case, the Supreme Court said, hate is not a word of casual connotation, refers only to the most extreme things. I can live with that. I don't think it's useful, but I think it's not reprehensible. But if it's so, then it doesn't cover many things. But it's always very, very difficult to decide what is hate and what is not. And each group and lobby in this woke society has its own category of things that have to be prevented. What about somebody saying we want a traditional family with a woman at home? What about somebody saying being a Zionist is racist against Palestinians, or being critical of Israel is racist against Jews? What about somebody who can't stand the idea of somebody publishing cartoons about Muhammad? What about cartoons making fun of Catholic priests? You can imagine that they would. So it's extremely difficult to draw the line. And inevitably, it's the groups that have more influence, more power, or which are fashionable at any given time that will succeed in getting their things declared hate. If you tried writing Gone with the Wind today in the antebellum South, you'd be accused of racism. On the other hand, you could do all sorts of other things that would not be. I'll point out an example from this weekend. I think it was either CNN or the Washington Post put an article which said, Black people never have lawyers and doctors that look like them. Isn't that what was said to Leo? You'd be more comfortable among your own kind. But not only is that not racism, that's considered woke, that's considered a really good thing, that they would be encouraged to do so. Whereas in my world, a Black man can go to a white doctor and a white man can go to a Black doctor, and we're just not going to allow restrictions of that sort. So the devil's in the definition.
I'll jump in if you don't mind, Christine. Again, I think what you pointed out is exactly what we're struggling with. What is offensive? What is discriminatory? What is racist? And what is hate? And I would submit that they are not all synonymous. There's no question that at some point or another you can overlap. But what is legal hatred versus legal racism in the terms of a definition versus legal discriminatory and perhaps even legally offensive. So if I'm offended by what someone says, I can sue them. That's what slander and libel is all about. If I feel that that I've been refused an apartment because of my ethnicity or my religion or my orientation, that's a discriminatory matter. And I take it to the Human Rights Tribunal. Same thing with racism. That's a discriminatory matter. The word racism isn't in the criminal code. And I think it's important to read the definition of hatred within section 319, which is every person who by communicating statements in a public place incites hatred against an identifiable group where such incitement is likely to result in a breach of the peace is guilty. And so there are a lot of components there. First of all, a private conversation is automatically not subject to the hate provision. Secondly, it has to deal with an identifiable group. And thirdly, it has to incite hatred and possibly lead to a breach of the peace. So when we break it all down, I think we can differentiate many of the comments that are made by others, this whole idea of wokeism, of cancel culture, and so on. Unless the cancel culture and whoever proposes it in a way that clearly is aimed at an identifiable group and is meant to incite hatred towards that group. So if you want to tear down the statue of Egerton Ryerson, for who Ryerson University is named after, because although he was one of the first proponents of free public education, he nevertheless also was a proponent, as part of the free public education, of having Indigenous kids taken away from their home and put into schools. You can deal with that. That is not hatred. That is part of debate that may or may not be offensive to people, and so on. On the other hand, if you're saying all white men who were members of the church ought to be murdered and massacred, that's a hate speech. So if I can help in that way.
Okay, is there anything else that any of you would like to say?
I just, the question I have hearing this is, where do you draw the line? I know that I spend some time on social media, and when I see a hateful comment that I'm concerned about, especially one that I feel that I'm not going to be able to counter with some free speech reasoning, I tend to report it and see where the social media algorithms, which is the usual response, and then if I complain, I get maybe a person is going to deal with it. And what I find is that the only time that they will take action is if the hate veers into violence, if you will. If there's a hint that they're going to encourage people to act on their hatred. Julius, would you put that line there? Would you say that, would you be more comfortable with legislation where there's a clear threat to violence, which is in some ways the American approach, isn't it? Is that a line that you would draw?
Yeah, well, a threat to violence is inciting a criminal act, but a direct criminal act. It's not a statement, for instance, in a case in British Columbia in the 1950s, a student who was a member of the Communist Party was denied entrance because communist theory is a threat of revolution and therefore violence, so he didn't get into the bar. I wouldn't agree with that, but I would agree that if somebody says, let's kill somebody, whether it's racial or religious or just individual or let's cull the population or whatever, I think that's a call to a crime, which in certain circumstances, if it was direct enough, if there was a real possibility, would be illegal. But I do think that you can never design a law which will catch hate and not go over. And for instance, the example given by Leo, if you were to defend John A. MacDonald or Ryerson or anybody like that, some people in the Native communities would say that's hate. That is it. It may be unpleasant, it may be terrible. One may sympathize with them, but it's not something that you can prohibit.
Well, then this is a question to Leo. With section 36, which reintroduces section 13, moving perhaps what's been the reserved duty of the criminal court system to deal with hate back into the human rights realm to police, if you will, hate on the internet. Is that the right direction? Would you prefer that it stay in the criminal area? It was a debate that we had loud and clear 10 years ago, and now it's back. I'm curious where you see is the right move. Are the commission or the tribunal specifically equipped deal with it. I take it Julius is not in favor of it, but I'm curious where you would lie with that. Is it
Well,
that
it's meant to deal with something that doesn't quite come up to snuff, if you will, as hatred, but it's meant to also have a discriminatory effect. And for many, many years, shall we say that the old Section 13 seemed to deal with only one type of quote unquote discriminatory speech, because I really do think there has to be a difference between hate speech and discriminatory speech. It then became a tool for anybody and everybody. So in the same sense that I don't think universal jurisdiction, whereby you can simply go anywhere and say, oh, I want the Prime Minister of the United States charged here, there, and everywhere, and create a chaos. I think I've changed my mind from what it was 10, 15 years ago when, as part of Simon Wiesenthal Center, we argued to keep Section 10. But there's, to go to another part of that question, and Christine had asked about anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism, if the wording, and it depends on the context, we need to have the speech that's actually there. But if you go to Section 319, and if you're saying that it's an inciting of hatred against an identifiable group, Zionists are an identifiable group. There's no reason why they shouldn't be. And if what you're saying is, for example, into the sea, that's an incitement to murder. Push all the Zionists into the sea. That's an incitement of hatred, and I think it can qualify under the criminal code, as opposed to a political statement, which is, we don't recognize Zionism. We think that all of Israel should be a uniform single state, blah, blah, blah. That's political. That wouldn't qualify certainly under the criminal code. So if we, again, maintain the distinction, but I don't think we should bring back the old Section 13. I think it's going to end up as it is. The various tribunals don't want to deal with this stuff. They are already dragging their heels as it is on a couple of cases that are certainly in Ontario before the tribunal, and they're doing everything that they can to avoid having to make a ruling.
Okay, we're going to have to move along shortly and get to the questions, because we do have a couple of those, but there's one thing I'd like to ask, particularly Julius and Leo, before we do go over to those questions. There is a tendency out there for some worry to be prevailing at this stage, because we mentioned today about wokeism and cancel culture, and we're living in a society where we're seeing a lot canceled out, and there's a sense of frustration that's building, and what kind of a society are we going to have, let's say, in the next 10 years. I'd like to know what your educated guesses are, Julius and Leo, on where this is headed and where you see our society in a decade or so down the road.
Okay, so I remember at McGill, there was an Indian general from India, and don't forget, it's only 20 years after the partition, by the way, between I and H, being India, between Islamic State of Pakistan and the Hindu Republic of India. And we stopped him from talking. And I remember feeling just fantastic about that. And later on, I said, what did we do? This is not a democracy. And in that sense, I agree with Julius Gray. You need to have free speech. We're coming back. It's another form. And what I'm sorry to say is that every 10, 15, 20 years, there seems to be some kind of a shift. And so what was in is out, and you get anger, and you get this feeling of upsetness, and you say, enough is enough, and I don't want to hear anymore about white men who may have explored and founded cities and provinces, but who in the process crushed indigenous people. Okay, you don't want to hear it? How do you teach history? But that's another topic. So I don't think we're that really different. It's a difference of kind, but not a real substantive difference of what was going on. We've always had people who have wanted to shut down others, and I'm embarrassed by what I did, having to shut down this general, or having to shut down somebody who wanted to talk about a Quebec independent state, or shutting down, other topics. So I don't think that we're really any different. 10 years from now, it'll be some other group.
Well, I think you're right. There's always some. But I think our society, the society we lived in from 1960 to 1980, was substantially freer than our society with freedom of expression. But at the same time, and it was becoming more and more equal. We had Medicare, we had pensions, we did all of these things. Our society today has retreated into identity politics. What I hope is that free speech will make us get up in the university and tell the people who want to throw out professors who are saying non-woke things, who want to control how history is taught, laugh at them. Don't shut them down. I wouldn't want to stop the woke from speaking. I just want to laugh at the woke and make it legal and safe to laugh at them. But I do think our society should go back into a progressive attitude about equality and social justice, and less identity and identity worries. Now we're obsessed with the collective ego. He's talking about us. Let's build a society together.
Beautiful. Okay, Anita, I'm going to throw it over to you now to take some of our questions as we go into the Q&A portion of our evening.
Well, thank you. It's been a fascinating discussion so far, and we have a few questions from one of the audience members. They're worrying about terrorism. We know that terrorists are influenced by the hate speech that they're seeing online. Free speech, will that counter the hate that's growing within them? Does not the criminal system or the human rights system have an important deterrent factor on that? How can we say that all speech is going to be okay with the reality of terrorism today?
Well, terrorism is undoubtedly a crime. There's no question. I have no difficulty with inciting to terrorism or terrorism being a crime. But I must point out that I don't think it's speech that causes terrorism. It's alienation. It's some of them for terrible reasons, people who are afraid that their sisters and daughters are being subjected to a materialistic, sexualized culture that they don't like. Other people who feel frustrated because they're poorer and unemployed. For instance, in France, the unemployment rate among the La Ceinture Rouge in the area where the Muslims live is stupendous and causes it. I think just like it's a mistake to say that hate speech brings about Nazism, economics mostly does, so it's a mistake to think that speech brings about terrorism. But terrorism and inciting to terrorism is undoubtedly a crime that I don't think any of us would have any difficulty with.
I tend to more or less agree with Julius. However, you end up becoming a terrorist. And I sat on a committee for 10 years that dealt with national security and terrorism. And that was the number one issue for the governments of the day, which is how do we stop it? Well, sometimes it has to do with socioeconomic issues. Sometimes it has to do with political issues. There are all kinds of reasons. But like anything else, you cross a line. And when you cross the line, at that point, it's terrorism. And at that point, the criminal code applies. So it's a difficult question, but that's why we have the laws. We have the laws, by the way, not to prevent, because laws by themselves can't prevent. You can't pass a law and simply say you can't be poor. You can't be poor. You need government to be able to have the right programs and so on. But you can certainly make it very clear once you cross a certain line that in fact you can then be subject to criminal sanctions.
Well, okay, so the follow-up question, I feel like I'm in Parliament here. Supplementary question would be, I think, from our audience member is then, would you then have allowed Hitler to continue until, would you not have wanted to nip him in the bud with hate crime charges when he was just a wee little thing before his reign of terror was unleashed?
Well, the thing about, sorry, go ahead, Julius.
He did go to jail. He was arrested for trying to overthrow the state in 1923, spent 2 years in jail, and he wrote Mein Kampf in jail.
I was just going to say the exact same thing. The thing about Hitler was that he was absolutely clear. There was no doubt. He'd stand up and he'd do exactly what Section 319 says you're not supposed to do, which is promote hatred against an identifiable group. So yes, if there was the equivalent of Section 319, of course he should have been prosecuted. And at that point, the only criticism I have is that the maximum was only 2 years, which is part of the problem that arose. So I don't think you can put him into the same category as somebody who just spouts off at the mouth.
Yeah, I'm always hesitant to bring up Hitler examples. Here we are. So I get another question that's coming up. Maybe let's turn to the campus for a minute. What is on where you would expect a certain level of intelligence on a campus debate where maybe free speech works, where you've got two individuals that are well informed or having a debate. But too often we hear, one side screaming at the other, slogans that to one side, let's take an example that we've heard, globalize the intifada, or from the river to the sea, which to many in the Jewish community that are aware of the issues are calls to violence, not only hate, but outright genocide. And when you see those phrases thrown around on campus, is free speech the answer to such rhetoric? I was actually reading a book by, I think I brought it with me, a book called It's Not Free Speech by Jennifer Ruth, and I don't remember who the other one was, I think it's Michael Berube. And they suggest that we have to be careful how we define free speech, because it's not just that both sides can shout at each other indiscriminately, when especially it comes to free speech on campus. If you're going to be shouting genocidal slogans, then there should be a reprimand. If you want to allow free speech where there's a level of academic rigor and a wholesome debate based on integrity and academic standards that we wish to uphold under the concept of rule of law, then that's another thing. Do you agree that a campus is a unique circumstance?
No, I think the problem with the campuses is not the freedom of speech. People shout at each other in campuses. People say stupid things. I remember we had Trotskyite, Maoists, etc., shouting things that were not hateful at all, but just very stupid. But what happens in today's campuses is that the university is very sensitive about donors. And they're very fearful that if you don't give in to the groups, they're going to boycott the donors, and the donors are going to say, hey, we're not going to finance you. If some group says, let's boycott Coca-Cola, or let's boycott this, or let's boycott that. So one of the problems is that the various pressure groups have a tool which frightens universities. Otherwise, you let them talk. There's no harm. You know, in Concordia at one point, they stopped Sven Robinson from speaking against Israel. The students went and shouted, and they stopped Netanyahu from speaking for Israel. Now, I thought both gentlemen should have been allowed to speak, but so they shouted at each other. It didn't change anything. But today, there are real threats to boycott and to prevent funding.
Well, first of all, I think we give too much credit and presupposing that university students are, quote, well-educated or well-informed or have the necessary background and knowledge to be able to debate an issue. We debated, if you want to call it that. We also struck over Vietnam and over atomic bombs in Alaska, and all kinds of other issues. Ultimately, a university is a slightly cloistered gathering of individuals. They want to yell at each other, they can yell at each other. I think, however, that the university administration today is overly sensitive, and I'm sorry, I disagree with Julius. I don't think it has anything to do with donors. I think it's just that there is a quote unquote public image that these universities feel that they have to put forward, and that they need to try and prevent themselves from being used. There are too many off-campus groups that come in, but you know, maybe that's the subject of another debate down the road.
So I'm going to pose a question for the two of you. We talked right at the beginning about dealing with issues of anti-Semitism and asking the question, is it really adequately dealt with today, particularly with what we're seeing with critical race theory? I'm of the opinion that anti-Semitism is not perhaps adequately dealt with. We saw, for instance, and I'm going right back to last May, and I'm going to be blunt here, during Operation Guardian of the Walls, it triggered a kind of a backlash where tens of thousands of people, pro-Palestinians, were demonstrating. And it got to the point where articles were being written by members of the Jewish community saying they have not seen anything like this. They have only seen it recorded during World War II, before it, and during that era where hate was to a point where Jews actually felt physically threatened. What kind of options do Jews have when it comes to protests that are calling for the death of Zionists, deaths to Israel, deaths to Jews, and so forth? We do see it in certain types of protests and Al-Quds rallies, and sometimes on campus. What are the options that a person can have with such kinds of intimidation? Because frankly, it's quite pervasive, and the question does prevail. What is being done and what can be done to alleviate these threats?
I think the way to alleviate these threats is to have freedom of expression, and somebody should form a group that would discuss these things rationally, that would say, on the one hand, that throwing any nation into the sea is completely irrational and ridiculous. At the same time, that strong criticism of any nation and of the occupation is permitted and is reasonable. Give both sides, do readings that have both positions taken. And I bet you, if you had a serious debate, that middle group would win out, both over the extremists, both over Rabbi Kahane and over the Palestinian zealots. If you had a group of people of all origins putting the issues fairly and justly and had a calm debate. So freedom of expression could probably deal with that sort of thing.
You know, Julius, I'm going to guess you don't use the internet much, though, because I don't find that rational discussion is the rule of thumb there. But can I jump in for a minute with one more question, perhaps? I think it's interesting. A lot of the legislation that's being proposed seems to very much focus on problems on the right. Although Holocaust denial might not be so much a right-left problem anymore, but you know, when you look at the legislation that's proposing banning hate symbols, they seem to, in the write-up, focus more on more typical hate groups, where in fact, you know, I think Julius, you suggested what's hate for one group is not necessarily another, but you know, the Iranian group, terrorist groups, or even some the Hamas flags and that are promoting hate, will that become hate symbols? But one of our audience members is asking, in light of these kinds of proposals that seem to focus on the right, do you think that we're doing a good job of looking at the spectrum, and perhaps does free speech, in your case, Julius, work better with one or the other? In Leo's case, or is the legislation hitting the mark, or where hate seems to be more across the spectrum, and yet the proposals seem to be still focused on, you know, the emanating from the right, which may not be the reality today anymore?
Well, the traditional left was not racist. What was right wing was conservative, or worse, fascist views. The left was not. Now, today's woke can easily move towards racism or sexism or whatever it is. And I don't want to repress them, as I said, but I think what we have lost is that romantic left, which wanted to create equality, not identity.
Forgetting about the romantic left, with great respect, Julius, if you think that the Soviet Union, for example, was non-racist, or that Eastern European countries were non-racist, then I think you're not giving full credit to the reality of those societies. There is no doubt, at least in my mind, that whether the symbols are of the far right or some of them from the far left, it is racism, and by definition, it may also be hatred, because it instills a hatred towards one group or the other. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that, generally speaking, we are raised, and we've raised our children and our grandchildren to be, quote unquote, small l, liberal. Always think of the other person, think of the other side, and, you know, be prepared to accept criticism, which is wonderful, except that it doesn't always come back towards us. So we end up having these difficulties, and where it's right and left, and unfortunately sometimes even center. You take a look at the Democratic Party in the United States. You take a look at aspects of our own political parties and their attitudes, and you see what the problem is. It's not right, it's not left, especially when it comes to anti-Semitism. It's everywhere.
I don't think anything in the Democratic Party or in our political parties or etc. would come close, even if it were considered slightly discriminatory, would come close to a definition of hate. And I think
no. That's why I didn't say hate. That's why I said discriminatory. I agree, you know, but sometimes it spills over into hate. But as a general form of anti-Semitism, and to me, anti-Semitism is expressed both with hatred, in which case it falls into section 319. It also is expressed as a form of discrimination, in which case it falls into the former section 13 of the Human Rights Act. And it's offensive, and you can sue, which is what happened with Irving and Professor Anita, please help me with her name.
Lipstadt, Deborah Lipstadt.
Yes, Deborah Lipstadt, exactly. So, you know, it's interesting. I suspect that anti-Semitism as a phrase is probably the only form of, and I don't want to use the word hate, but is the only form that covers all levels and all aspects of hate, to discrimination, to racism, to being offensive. It's not something that we should be proud about.
Christine, there is one more question. I don't think we could really, I don't want to ignore any of our audience members. Is a woman is asking if she's threatened by another religious group, she singles out one over another. But let's say anybody comes up to you and say, one day we're going to take over the world and you're going to become the same religion as me by force. Does she have a recourse? Should she look to the criminal laws? What's her recourse to that kind of threat?
No, that's what's called proselytizing. And proselytizing is what most religions, except maybe the Jewish one, were doing a lot of. That's a debate about, you know, my God is going to be greater than your God, or we will overcome you. I don't think she has any, certainly not in the criminal courts.
remember Khrushchev said, "We will bury you."
That's right.
He was allowed to say it with political rhetoric. He was wrong, but he did say in the United Nations.
I want to thank you and turn it back to Christine at this point. It's obviously an important discussion, and I hope it was of interest to our viewers.
This was a very engaging discussion. I'd like to thank you, Julius, Leo, and of course, Anita, for standing in. And I'd like to thank all of you for watching. And I do hope that you were given some good food for thought, because our experts today certainly did give much needed information and hope, may I add, in the climate that we're facing today. So once again, thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody.